Good morning and welcome to this webinar today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're pleased that you can join us for this webinar. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series, number 12 in the 2016 series, because we're talking about 2016 in review. Our sponsors today are the Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce and the Great Lakes Chapter Association of Contingency Planners. We'd like to have you as friends and as followers. You can follow us on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, Twitter, we're known as Firestorm Soul, and there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We do want to remind you that the presentation today is not complete with accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have a long-term relationship with Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce and the Eastern Great Lakes chapter of the Association of Contingency Planners. You can go to firestorm.com and watch past webinars in this series, and you can also register for future webinars that will be going on monthly throughout 2017.
Bill, I'll jump in and just talk about the ACP, the Association of Contingency Professionals. The name change came in earlier, I think, during the summer. As we look at it, if you're not a member of the Eastern Great Lakes chapter, I would encourage you to do so. It's a chance to network with others and learn more about what's going on in each of those areas. Dr. Redmond is normally with us, and she couldn't be with us today, but we appreciate the support and working together with the chapter and then with the association nationally. My name is Jim Satterfield. I'm the president and co-founder of Firestorm. And after the first of the year, we'll be announcing a couple of new things that are happening at Firestorm. So you might want to catch that first webinar next year in January. Bill did point out that this was a series in 2016, and as we've done each year, these are recorded if you want to go back and review or learn more about a particular area and an exposure. You can find them on our website. You can go to firestorm.com and have a chance to look through each of those areas, and there are training videos and other topics available again to everyone. So today we started to sit down and look at the year in review, and anytime you have a year that's a presidential election, you've got all the other events that are going on. It is certainly puts us in a different perspective as we think about our role as business continuity professionals or senior leaders within our individual companies, and what does that mean and where do we need to focus. And this year I think it again came back and hit on a theme that we've talked about before, but I wanted to go back and retouch, and it's planning for the unplanned. We've certainly seen a great many things that occurred this year around violence, whether you're looking at violence just as a terrorist attack or unrest. We had the earthquake in Italy, the bomb explosions in New York City. We just had the burning of the building in Los Angeles, and 36 people died in it. We've had numbers of attacks for violence throughout the year, the shootings in the nightclub, the shootings on school campuses, the shooting of police, the shooting of people arrested for crimes. There's just all of these events that are unplanned. Certainly cyber breach remains at the top of our list with the attacks that occur there. And one of the common things that we're finding is that a cyber breach is a business crisis, not an IT crisis. And looking at those, and a lot of these elements, unlike the distributed denial of service that's up on the screen, come as a result of errors that your employees make, where they're clicking on an attachment, where they're going to a site, they're following a link, and it's creating and inserting with the malware or ultimately the ransomware or others within it. all of these things become and start with being unplanned by the people that were involved with them. That's the reason why you have emergency plans within your business. That's the reason why you're looking at a business continuity program or an IT disaster recovery program or communicable illness or others as we plan in each of those individual areas. The actions that we take will make a difference. So if we're thinking about all these things and they're out there and they're unplanned, what do we do? And you really have to start with a strong foundation. I think the picture that you see there is the foundation that was put in place for building the new World Trade Center. And clearly, when we think about the significance of 9/11 and what that meant to us as a country and as organizations, where do we start? Where do we try to go? And having a strong foundation makes a difference within your company and your plans. As we think back about the crises there, we're seeing those themes come back up. So in returning back to that planning for the unplanned, in most organizations we're thinking about looking at what are the impacts. And if you view a crisis in this area, it really comes from one of four areas. Something happened to our facility. Something happened to our workforce. Something happened to our information security and technology, or something happened to us from a brand and reputation standpoint. Those are the four areas of vulnerability that we have within every organization. Now, they can certainly be intertwined. You can have multiple of those events occurring. And the cause of those disruptions can vary. Workforce, it doesn't matter if that's a violence issue. I'm getting a little bit of an open feedback from a mic, and I don't know if that's you, Bill, or if it's our other.
I believe Dr. Redmond has joined us now.
Oh, Dr. Redmond, if you're here, do you want to make a comment? We went past your point, but it'd be nice to have you insert here. I'd be glad to stop. Doctor?
Jim, can you hear me? This is Ken Rokamp.
Hey, Ken, good to hear you.
Okay, I'm here for Michael. Yeah, I was having technical difficulties, so
no
so I am on.
Welcome on board.
But go ahead and continue on. Since I'm late, go ahead and continue on. We can catch up at the end.
All right, I'll give you an opportunity to talk about the Eastern Great Lakes chapter at the end, and we'll go from there. So welcome, and glad that you're here with us. So in planning, by the way, if anybody ever doubted if these were live, you now know that they are in fact live as we do this. So the impacts then come from these four areas. So if the disruption in the workforce was a communicable illness or it was a violence event, you still need to be prepared for those areas. So thinking about the exposures and your risk, you could then start to plan for something that happens at your facility, something that happens to your staff, something that happens either to your information security or your technology, or something that happens to your brand and reputation. As we look at those elements, that needs to come into your plans. So what you do and how you respond to those will determine what the impacts are going to ultimately be within the organization. Now, we've shared with you a couple of times that the actions that you take and the words that you say in that first hour are going to become very, very critical. We'll come back to that theme in a few minutes. But if you think about any disaster or crisis event, you're going to be pressed within your organization. What should we do? What should we say? So planning for that, it would be an opportunity for you to sit down and build that foundation to say, here's a vulnerability and a threat. What would its impact be? If that occurred, what would I do? What would I say? And you can start to plan that out. The planning could relate easily around message maps for the communications. It could be working within your plan. So in both of those aspects, you need to have a way to make the critical decisions, the crisis decisions, so that you haven't left anything out. You've dealt with the stakeholders. You've dealt with the organization that you prepared in those areas. So let me see if I can get my slide to move. There we go. So I would recommend that you think about establishing a formal crisis management program in advance to really evaluate the threats and risk and how you're going to put those things in place. That's the way that you can, within your own organization, be prepared for the unplanned. Similarly, just as we've identified the threats and risks and their impacts and the actions and the words that we're going to say, you have to create an open source intelligence network. By the way, there seems to be now some convergence around the phrasing open source intelligence. We think about intelligence in a military application a great deal. If you're a general going into battle, you would want to know where's the enemy, what's their force count, what type of weapons do they have, what direction are they moving. And so getting the intelligence is very critical in terms of understanding it. Today, there's open source information that you can get from social media, the comments that are there. There are multiple ways either to measure the event through directly or through derivatives that could be indications that those elements were going on. So I would encourage you to sit down and begin to think about the open source intelligence and how you monitor for all of the threats and risks that you've done. You already are doing monitoring of weather. You've got a plan that says, hey, we're in Western New York. We could have a significant ice storm, snowstorm here. Many of you that are on the call are in the banking industry. And, you know, do we keep our branches open? Do we close our branches? What do we do in those particular areas? So planning on how your open source intelligence network works, who's responsible for the monitoring, what is the medium that you're using, and what are the monitoring tools, and then how does that information get processed within your organization. We also now are starting to see this move into the area of contractors. The government contractors, as of the end of the year, are going to be required to have a threat intelligence program in place and insider threat program in place. And if you look at that, that's the benefit of having Mr. Snowden and the activities that he did has now placed the government on notice that they need to make sure that everyone is supporting them there. So if it's best practices and the regulatory requirement in that sector, it will be the same within your business. Third here, if you're trying to plan for the unplanned, you've got to have how we're going to make decisions. And checklists are very good, having an organized team. You've got to have a formula where your senior leadership will be involved in that process, and you need to hold tabletop exercises and tests. We're working with several organizations now and thinking about first quarter testing their plans for 2017. Now, if this happens, if this threat or issue occurs, what's your response strategy? What are we going to communicate? And we can certainly look at those events that are likely to occur and then be prepared for them in advance. So if we think about what's a bad response, what's when people are poor, and I use the term poor here instead of bad, many times we find that organizations and individuals become overconfident. Oh, we're good, we can handle anything. It's not an issue for us to be concerned about. We're smarter than everybody else. And that, look, we'll just solve it on the fly. And if you look at it, we've started to see where people respond before they thought through that there'd be impacts. The posting that you see up on your screen occurred earlier this year after the election, and that comment went up, and as you can imagine from reading it, you could see where it would create a significant backlash on the organization. This was a contractor working for a company who made this comment, and then starts to defend that the response that the mayor put in place associated with it. And as you look at how the individuals were all involved and the responses that came out, there's a general rule, and we'll bring it up again, but let me state it here. If you find yourself in a crisis and you find yourself explaining, you're going to be losing. There's just no way to explain many of the things that are here. And so obviously the poor response, they thought they handled this, they thought they had it in place, and they thought the problem would go away. And it's again, you start to see that this thing was escalated and pressures, and multiple people lost their job associated with the response. So planning these areas out and being prepared in advance makes a difference. Other characteristics is you don't have controls in place. You don't have the resources identified that you're going to go to. If you're dealing in the cyber area, does your outside legal counsel have background and experience in dealing with that? Do you have forensic resources that you can bring into play? If you're dealing in communications, do you have someone that has expertise in crisis communications as opposed to regular public relations? Public relations is great in peacetime, but when we think about a crisis, you want to channel that event differently. You want to be able to deal directly with your employees or your customers or your vendors. You don't go through the media in which to be able to get those areas. We also see if you don't have the intelligence to see how, it's an intelligence network, not ignorance from an intelligence. If you're not getting the feedback, you're not seeing what the reactions to people are in terms of saying it. We're seeing comments at every level going out immediately over Twitter. We're seeing reactions coming in and surprise as a result of it, as an example that we just talked about. Finally, we're seeing boards that interfere with management's ability to manage the crisis. They're asking questions. They're saying, we've got to get out in front of it. We've got to frame that issue. The listing there of Prince George's County, they'd had a series of sexual abuse issues there. And as a result of that, the involvement of the board and the involvement of the county executive, the involvement of the superintendent of the school district, all of those came into question because of the repeated patterns there. They were not prepared. They thought they had everything in place, and obviously it didn't occur. Now, I don't know if you caught it, but around 9/11, the mattress company, here it's the Miracle Mattress Company, posted a video and tried to use 9/11 as a way to sell more mattresses. Obviously, from a poor taste standpoint, this goes to the top of our list in a variety of areas. And then Mike here, who wrote this letter and posted it out, is the owner of the company. And he's going, hey, I didn't know anything about it. It's not my job. So you either, in these situations, demonstrate that you don't have control within your organization. Is this an incompetence issue? Is it a different term? To think about the consequences of anything that you say and do before you say and do it. And one of the common themes we find is that we don't break down in a crisis and stop and say, what are the immediate, what's the mid-range, and what are the long-term consequences of the actions that were coming? Now, I often say that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. Because if you're at work and someone comes running into your office with a surprise, they're not running in with good news. They're running in, there's a problem, and we need to deal with it. So we need to think about how we respond in those critical situations, because the pressures are on our organization and on us all in a leadership position to help support our organization through that crisis. So the first 24 hours are crucial. In that first hour in particular, the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say will determine, is this crisis going to stabilize or escalate? Now, so that first 24-hour period becomes extremely critical around every one of these aspects. So we have a rule of 5. We want you to ask why 5 times before you send that communications out, before you speak, before you make a statement on these events. If the process of asking why slows everything down for you to understand the consequences of the actions and the words that you're going to say in that process. Now, most of what you learn initially in a crisis is wrong. And so you're going to be forced to make decisions on wrong and incomplete information. When someone comes to you and says, oh, well, we need to get a press release out, you want to ask why. And they give an answer, then ask why. If you go through that process 5 times and there's good answers to all 5 questions, then there's no question you should move forward. If you can't identify that, then you shouldn't move forward with the communications at that time, because that communications will make the crisis worse and increase the impact. So everything is very fluid initially in that crisis. You're on that tightrope that's out there to focus. You're going to be pressured to communicate, and that pressure will likely come from somewhere high up in the organization, a senior leader, a board member, and you're going to continually be asked to communicate. Slow it down, ask why. If you repeat it, then it's clear. Then you know why you're communicating and when you do that level of response associated with it. So this whole area around communications, and the reason we're spending so much time on it today is we look back at the lessons from 2016 and what did we learn? We learned that this is the point where you see the impacts of these crises being multiplied, being increased as a result of lack of control within the organization to have those messages out. We'll give you some sample messages in a few minutes to help support that. Let's go back to our friends in Prince George's County. How do you explain sexual abuse? The answer is you don't. It's wrong. It's evil. It shouldn't have occurred. So as you think about this, you want to have broad messages if you have to communicate, not specific. We don't give numbers. We don't give statistics. We don't give those types of areas. If there is an event where someone has been injured or killed and you have involvement from first responders, police, or fire, let them talk about the problem. They're talking about what's occurred, their investigation and dealing with it. They're going to give those types of things. They're going to be associated with it. Quite frankly, I've not run into a police chief or a fire chief who didn't love the camera, who wanted to have that bully pulpit to talk. You do not want to have that associated with it. When you talk, and you talk within your organization, you're going to talk about the future, and we'll give you those themes in a few minutes of where you're going to focus. But just look at the images of the people on that shot that's there. It's very clear that this conversation isn't going forward the way quite that they would have hoped. So in a crisis, there are three types of communications that come out. The communication for coordination, that's what do you need to do. It's generally life and safety. It's one of the very first things that you want to get out. Second is communications about the brand or the crisis itself. And third is communications around compliance. Now, you probably followed in the news just recently the fires that were outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and the numbers of people who lost their lives. I think the final count I saw was 14 individuals. There were hundreds of homes and businesses destroyed associated with it. And one of the problems in that particular event, in the analysis, is the communication to evacuate did not go out on time as it was expected to do. As you look at that, that was a particular problem. That should have been one of the first communications out. You need to focus on it. I'm still getting an open mic feedback from somebody. So if we could get that muted, it would be a help. So thinking about it, that's the first thing you want to do if there's a crisis, is focus on communications that are around life and health and safety and what do you need people to do. The attack recently on Ohio State, there was a campus attack. And so they looked at the 3 C's, and the first thing they did was to relate of what they needed to do, whether it was shelter in place, that clearly providing them additional escalations of that knowledge and information as it went out at that point in time. So your first communication is always around life and safety, and primarily it's internal. Now, you also are going to communicate to first responders, to 9/11, to get help coming in. So your first communications is around that. As you think and the event is stabilized and individuals are protected and the actions are going, then you can start to think about some of the communications around crisis. And here President Drake was talking about #Buckeye Strong and what they needed to do and how they needed to place those elements within it. So you give those types of supporting communications after the event, after you have a look at the brand and reputation. You're not going to deal with compliance-related things until later, after all the facts are known. And in fact, in most of these events, we would recommend that you not hold a press conference or a meeting. Let the first responders and the other authorities deal with those. Now, I promised you messages, and you have heard these before, but let me come back and share them with you. If you find yourself in a crisis and you're helping your organization figure out what are the messages that we need to get out, after you've given the directions, and generally in a crisis, there are 4 things you can do. You can evacuate, you can shelter in place, you can lock out, you can lock down. Shelter in place is generally if there's a health risk outside of the building. There's a tornado, there's a lightning storm. Inside the building is better. If you think about evacuate, there's something wrong in the building. The building's on fire, we need to get out. Or we want to get away from the shooter that's involved. If there's a physical violence threat, whether that's civil unrest, terrorism, or an active shooter, a lockout means that the threat is outside of the building, and so we would lock our doors. A lockdown means that the threat is inside our building, and we're trying to buy time until help comes. So those are the compliance related, both the emergency and missions communications as we move through. If you're thinking about crisis communications, the 3 themes that you can always adapt in any crisis are we will not be defined by this event. No matter how horrifically bad it is, it's not what your organization is about. It's not the business that you're in. Something happened, but that's not going to define who you are. Number 2, we're going to invent the future. We're going to make sure that we put processes and procedures in place to make this the safest place to work, to make sure that we are protecting everyone that's involved. But the key message comes at the end. But really what we're looking here to do are to support the families, those people that were hurt or injured or had their identity stolen or whatever the nature of it would be. That's where we're going to put our focus in. If you talk about these 3 areas, not being defined by the event, what you're going to do going forward, not what caused the problem, what you're going to do going forward, and then finally, what are you going to do to help the people that were directly impacted? That's really what needs to come out. These 3 messages are significantly better than, quote, no comment. You're not going to be able to, or trying to explain why it occurred. Why did this person who was mentally ill come into your organization and shoot everyone? Those are not discussions that are good to think about. You also are under confidentiality. You can't talk about employees. You can't share specific information about them. So you've got confidentiality issues around the details that are associated. So, but we're also in an area where we're not going to be able to manipulate the media. You can't control. It's not a matter that you can go to them and they're going to say exactly what you want them to say and do. Today, we can speak directly to our employees. We can speak directly to our vendors. We can speak directly to our customers. We can speak directly to our shareholders. If you look at that, that's the direction we want to go through so that our message doesn't get interpreted by a third party. You'll look on your screen, you'll see 2 issues of the Wall Street Journal issued on the same day at different times in the day. And you'll see the first message was Trump softens his tone. The second, Trump talks tough on the wall. And you'll notice the photograph is identical. It's the same event. It's 2 different interpretations of the event by one media outlet. If you're communicating through the media, your message will be interpreted for their objectives from their orientations. You know how to reach your folks. We want you to be able to deal directly in those channels. Here's a prime example of what happens if you attempt to communicate through the media. Firestorm's been around for 11 years, actually over 11 years now, and one of the things that we look back to is when we first started, we were pretty much forced to communicate through the media. Today, that's probably your vehicle of last resort to get a message out. You should be communicating directly, and those two headlines, I think, clearly emphasize what can happen in that process. By the way, when we arrive at a crisis and we're helping a company and someone says, look, I know how to handle the media, that's probably one person that you need to train most within it. But in thinking about this, it's really time to shift over and think about consequence management and what is this going to mean. Kellogg pulls their ads from that publication amid hate speech concerns. They came up with a Dump Kellogg's petition for those people who thought, wait a minute, why are you doing this? And then finally, Dump Kellogg's breakfast ban, blacklist Breitbart declares hate for 45 million readers. So the publication turned this back on Kellogg's, and these were unintended consequences that Kellogg's experienced as a result of that. So this is a perfect example of what we were talking about. When you take action, when you make statements, what are the possible consequences associated with those? Because the resulting activities can easily be greater than the concern that you had at the very beginning. So those are the situations that we see coming in each place. So what are you missing? If this is what's going to happen, what do we need to look at? You know, in that blue quadrant there, what you know you don't know. In the green quadrant, you know what you know. Those you're pretty confident of. But you'll notice in the chart that's listed here, the greater exposure is what you don't know, you don't know. You don't know what's going to happen as you're coming from each of those areas. That's why, for all the vulnerabilities and threats that you've listed, having an open source intelligence program, having an active monitoring program is going to make a difference within your organization. If you don't, you're going to continually find that you're surprised, and you're going to not make the best decisions. You certainly aren't going to having the right communications going out. And so I think as we look ahead to 2017, if you don't have a formal intelligence program within your organization, then that's going to be the only way that you're going to really make a significant difference within your. So we have to have that information coming in so that we can predict what the next threat will be, what the emerging threat is. It gives us a chance to confirm the facts that are out there, to control the messages, identifying the consequences. Who are our brand advocates that are out there? Who are our brand detractors? The open source intelligence places the organization in the best possible position in a crisis. And as I said earlier in today's webinar, it's going to, in many cases, be a derivative variable that you're going to look for and measure. And we can do a session in the future on the details around it. By the way, for those of you going to the DRJ Disaster Recovery Conference later, there's going to be a workshop there on open source intelligence. So there are 5 common failures in a disaster, and we see these repeated in each individual area. And so these start to give you some of the areas that you want to focus on as we think about open source intelligence. The largest single failure in a disaster or crisis is a critical supply chain failure. By the way, that's held true regardless of the cause of the crisis. The cyber breaches that have made the headlines, and many of those, they came as a result of a vendor who had access and the breach occurred that way. Training employees for home and at work. The surveys show that 70 or 80% of your employees don't know what to do in a disaster or crisis, and that 95% don't have a plan at home. So seeing what your employees are saying as the crisis starts, what are they communicating both internally and externally? Identify and monitor all threats and risks. That's the 3rd most common failure. We generally do, as business continuity professionals, a good job in identifying many, many, many of the threats and risks. But we generally do a very poor job of monitoring them, and not as much effort is spent on what that area of program should look like. Fourth is failure to conduct exercises and update your plans. If you don't test your plans, you won't know that they will work. Regularly, we're called into organizations, and the plans are 7, 8, 10 years old. The company has reorganized in many respects, and so their plan is destined not to work even when it is before it even occurs. And then finally, develop a crisis communications plan. What the individual said, and we've given you many slides here today showing you how those communications had the issues there. Identifying for every one of the threats and risks that you did up on the third item. If that were to occur, what would be your communication? I was in a conference with a group this week, and we asked them, had they developed all their messages, and we described the various things that could happen, and they said, oh, that's very likely it would happen. Well, what's your message? Well, we don't have one. Trying to design that message in the middle of a crisis is wrong. It's easier to edit than it is to create. So for every vulnerability and threat, you need to have a specific monitoring plan with specific triggers to activate your plan, clear understanding of the impact if that were to occur, then a clear understanding of what are the messages that you're going to say at that point in time. So as we think about it, we always are looking at improving our performance in a crisis. Up on the screen is the Firestorm Crisis Management Maturity Model Rating. You notice that we look along the left at the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and then finally the communications effectiveness. If you're a stage 1 company, that means that you're really in a liability stage. Everything's going to come as a surprise. Stage 2, you've got some of the basic elements there, but you're still in a reactive mode. Stage 3 is much more supportive. You've thought through these things. You've got them in place. And finally, a stage 4, it's a part of your culture. Obviously, our goal is to move to the right of the chart. But if you look at each of the 5 dimensions along the way, and you were trying to say as an organization, how mature are we from a crisis management standpoint? If 3 or 4 of those are to the right, but 1 is down to the left, well, that's going to mean that that's the measurement that makes the difference. So if you don't have a good decision process, if you don't have clear roles and responsibilities, if you don't have information clarity and data and metrics to look at these events, if it takes you too long to make a decision because the clock's moving, and finally, if you can't communicate effectively, you're not going to have a positive outcome in a crisis. Now, as we think ahead to 2017, I will guarantee you that your plans will be tested next year. Now, we can do that one of 2 ways. You can do it before a crisis and test your plans, and all the standards, whoever standard you're planning, whichever practice that you're following to look at the best practices, require annual testing of plans. If you don't do that, then there's a likelihood that you'll be tested by an event, and that will determine where you are. Obviously, the impacts of the test in the middle of a crisis versus the tests of planning in advance makes a difference. So I would encourage you to think about testing your plans, looking at your actions and your communications and your decision processes, looking at your open source intelligence before you find yourself in that crisis environment. So as you look at the Predict, Plan, Perform methodology that we talk about in all the webinars, predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are. What are their impacts? How are you going to monitor them? What are the triggers that activate your plans? Your plans have to include actions, decisions, and words. And in particular, I will tell you, what you do in the first hour will determine is this situation going to stabilize or escalate. And then finally, perform. That's the training everybody on your plans. That's the testing your plans, and then managing in the crisis. So there is a brief on today's webinar with some of the slides in it and some of the material that we've been talking about. You can go to our website, click on it, and download the brief. And the webinar is being recorded today, so if you want to share that with others in your organization, you'll be able to do it. Our thanks go out to the Greater Rochester Chamber of Commerce and the Eastern Great Lakes Association chapter of the Association of Contingency Professionals that was a tongue twister for me today, and the sponsorship of this webinar series. Since you weren't on at the very beginning and had a problem getting in, I apologize for the hassle that you had. Do you want to share any thoughts and tell us about any upcoming events at the Association of Contingency Professionals?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, this is Ken Rokamp from EGLACP, we call it. But anyways, I'm listening to your presentation. I really like your point that you made about to make sure that not just to communicate, to appear to addressing the crisis, and to ensure that when you do communicate, that the message is carefully crafted for the target audience and reviewed by different individuals to reduce misinterpretation. I think that's key. It's even key just in business, just when you're doing communications, just normal communications, just to make sure that your message is crafted to the target audience and that there is less chance of misinterpretation. I thought that was a great point. And like Jim said, go ahead, Jim, what's that?
I was going to say, when's the next meeting? What are the opportunities for those that are listening?
Actually, I don't have that information right in front of me. So I'm having technical difficulties with my computer, and so I'm having so many issues here today.
Sorry about that.
I mean, I'm having problems even typing notes out because something's going on. So so I have to apologize for that. But I can say this, like you said, we're Eastern Great Lakes Association chapter for the continuity professionals, and we specialize in cyber information security, business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management. And we like to welcome any new members, and if anybody wants to get more information about the chapter, they can call our president, Michael Redmond, and that is at 917-882-5453 for more information. Once again, that's 917-882-5453. And our next meeting isn't until after the new year, so I'll have to, if you go to our website, you can find information on that. So.
And we'll update you in the webinar after the first of the year, so you'll see that. Thank you for your comments today. By the way, that slow computer and hassle, that's a possible indicator of a breach. So you'll have some excitement in your office later today. If you look at this,
I was going to say it's a thin client, which is even more concerning.
So for those of you who would like to look at previous webinars or to download the briefs, you can go to firestorm.com. You'll also get a schedule of coming events. If you've got a particular question, you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can give us a call at 800-321-2219. I think as we think about the world that we're in, there's an Irish blessing or an Irish curse, depending upon which way you think about it. And it's, may you live in interesting times. I am continually reminded that those are issues that we need to look at and think about in each of these areas. There are interesting times around us. Your organization depends upon the leadership that you have placed, the plans that you have, and the ability to respond. Because we're in a situation where the crisis itself may last seconds or minutes, but the consequences can last for years. It can define your organization. And those types of events have a significant impact on abilities to earn money for employees or the companies to survive and to carry forward. We live in a time where there are events that could significantly disrupt your organization, whether it's a cyber breach that people lose confidence in the organization, your ability to operate, or whether it's violence. I think as we continue to talk in 2017, you're going to see us continue to focus on behaviors of concern. Our strategy here is to identify those behaviors, that's the open source intelligence, before they escalate to violence in your organization. So those are activities I'd like you to think about, and hopefully today has been helpful. Thank you all for your time this morning. I wish you happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and any celebration that you want to follow at this point. And we'll look forward to speaking with you again in the new year. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.